Chapter 2. The Pipe. The gorgeous noble, that is, Jinshi, was busier than Mau Mau had realized. As a eunuch, she'd assumed the rear palace represented his entire workload, but it seemed he had much business in the outer court as well. At the moment, Jinshi was making a face at some paperwork. He'd indicated that he was going to be stuck in his office the entire day, so Mau Mau had no option but to work around him as she cleaned. She was collecting scrap paper in one corner of the room. The paper was of excellent quality, but covered with awful suggestions, ideas that were in the trash because they were hardly worth looking at. No matter how worthless the suggested statutes scrawled on them, however, the paper they were written on couldn't be reused. It had to be burned. Think of the tidy bit of pocket change it would bring if I could sell it, Mau Mau thought. It wasn't a very nice thought. Still, she reiterated to herself that this was her job. She knew she had to burn the stuff. There was a fire pit for trash in one corner of the large palace complex surrounding Jinshi's office, over by the military training grounds and some storehouses. Ah, the military, Mau Mau thought. Honestly, she wasn't eager to get anywhere near them, but she had no choice. She was just getting to her feet, resigned that this was her duty, when she felt something settle across her shoulders. "It's chilly out. Please wear this." Gauchwin, showing his thoughtful side, had placed a cotton jacket on her back. There was a dusting of snow on the ground, and the wind could be heard to rattle the desiccated branches of the trees. The warm room, heated by several braziers, made it easy to forget, but they were still hardly a month into the new year. It was the coldest season of all. "Thank you very much," Mau Mau said. She really meant it. It seemed such a waste to have made Gauchwin a eunuch. That extra layer of insulation would make a lot of difference. As she ran her arms through the sleeves of unbleached cotton, she realized Jinshi was watching her intently, practically glaring at her, in fact. Did I do something wrong? Mau Mau tilted her head in curiosity, but then she realized it didn't seem to be her Jinshi was glaring at so much as it was Gauchwin. Gauchwin, noticing the gaze as well, flinched. This is from Master Jinshi, I hasten to add. I'm only the messenger." For some reason, Gauchwin gesticulated broadly as he spoke. Suffice to say, he didn't sound wholly convincing. Is he being reprimanded for taking too much initiative? Mau Mau wondered, marveling that he should have to get permission for something so simple as giving a cotton jacket to a maid. It wasn't easy being Gauchwin either. "Is that so?" was all Mau Mau said. She bowed in Jinshi's direction, then hefted the basket of paper scraps and made for the fire pit. "I wish you'd planted some here too, Dad," Mau Mau thought to herself with a sigh. The outer court was many times larger than the rear palace, yet boasted far fewer herbs that might make worthwhile ingredients. She'd succeeded in finding little more than dandelions and mugwort. Then again, she'd discovered some red spider lilies as well. Mau Mau enjoyed eating red spider lily bulbs soaked in water. The only caveat was that the bulbs were poisonous, and if the poison wasn't successfully extracted first, it could produce the mother of all tummy aches. More than once the old madam had snapped at her not to eat things like that, but it was Mau Mau's nature, and that wasn't going to change. "Guess this is about the best I can hope for," she thought. The dearth of plant life in winter made it hard enough to find anything. Even with careful searching, she didn't expect to come up with much more than she had. Mau Mau started to consider planting some seeds on the sly. As she walked back from the garbage pit, Mau Mau spotted someone else she recognized. He was over by a row of plaster storehouses at some distance from Jinshi's office. He was a young military official with a strong, manly face that nonetheless showed an obvious decency, giving him something of the look of a big, friendly dog. Ah, yes, Lihaku. The color of his sash was different from before. Mau Mau discerned that he must have moved up in the world. Lihaku was talking to what appeared to be some subordinates standing beside him. He's working hard, Mau Mau thought. Every time he had a little break, it seemed, Lihaku could be found at the Verdigris house, chatting with the apprentices over tea. Of course, his real objective was Mau Mau's beloved sister Pyadine, but to call her forth required almost as much silver as a commoner might make in half a year. Oh, woe betide the man who had tasted the nectar of heaven. Now he sought even the barest, the most occluded glimpse of the countenance of that flower that grew on the high mountain top. Maybe Lihaku sensed Mau Mau's pitying gaze upon him, for he waved to her and came jogging over, bounding like the big dog he was. Instead of a tail, the kerchief holding his hair flapped behind him. "Ho! How unusual to see you outside the rear palace, accompanying your mistress on a day out." He clearly didn't know that Mau Mau had been dismissed from service in her old workplace. She'd been back in the pleasure district only for a very brief time, so she had never bumped into Lihaku there. "No," she said, "I no longer serve in the rear palace, but in the personal quarters of one particular personage." It would be altogether too much trouble, Mau Mau thought, to tell the whole story of her dismissal and rehiring. Thus she reduced it to this single sentence. Personal quarters? Whose? Somebody must have very strange tastes. Yes, strange indeed. Lihaku didn't know how insolent he was being, but his reaction as such was an understandable one. Most people wouldn't specifically seek out a thoroughly freckled, spindly branch of a girl to be their personal attendant. In fact, Mama hadn't necessarily intended to continue with her freckles, but Jinji had ordered her to keep them, though she didn't understand why, and if her master commanded, she had to obey. I just don't know what he's after, that man. Mama concluded that the thinking of nobles was simply beyond her. Say, I hear some important official just bought out a courtesan from your place. So it seems. Guess I can't blame him for this one, Mama thought. When the employment contract had been concluded and Mama was to go with Jinshi, her overexcited sisters had prettied her up in every way they knew how, finding the most special clothes for her, doing her hair, and covering her in a mountain of makeup, until she looked like anything but an ordinary maid headed to an ordinary posting. She remembered her father, for some reason, watching her go as if watching a calf leave his barn. To enter the palace looking like a tarted-up courtesan was bad enough, but Jinshi's presence attracted yet more attention, and Mama found a very uncomfortable number of eyes on them. She'd changed as soon as she could, but no doubt quite a few people had seen her before then. Still, she was struck that Lihaku could be speaking of her, to her, and have no idea. But, she supposed, what more could you expect from a dumb mutt? If I may say so, you seem to be in the middle of something. Do you really have that time to be talking to me? Oh, heh. One of Lihaku's subordinates was coming over to check on him. He looked happy at first to see a woman there. A man living on a salary as poor as his was apt to be suffering from a drought of fairer sex. But when he saw Mau, his disappointment was palpable. She was used to this reaction, but it also showed some of what made the superior superior and the subordinate not. There was a fire, Lihaku said, jerking his thumb in the direction of the storehouses. Not a big one. They're not that unusual this time of the year. Still, he had to investigate the cause, which was what he was currently doing. Cause unknown, eh? Mama thought. Now that she'd gotten a sniff of the story, she would have stuck her nose in even if someone had begged her not to. Mama slipped between the two and headed toward the small building. Hey, better keep your distance, Lihaku called. I understand, Mama said, scrutinizing the building and everything around it. There was soot on one side of the cracked plaster walls. It looked like they'd been lucky the fire hadn't spread to any of the other storehouses. If this was simply a small fire, then there were several unusual things about it. For one, why had Lihaku come to deal with it personally if it was so ordinary? Surely he could have ordered some lackey to do it. What was more, the building seemed substantially damaged, more like the effects of an explosion than a short-lived blaze. Maybe someone had even been injured. They must suspect arson, Mau concluded. It would be one thing to burn down a random storehouse somewhere, but on the palace grounds themselves, that was something else. Mama's country was largely peaceful, but this wasn't to say no one had any grievances against the government. Barbarian tribes occasionally conducted raids, and droughts and famines did sometimes occur. Relations with other states were largely cordial, but there were no guarantees as to how long they would stay that way, and there must have been some inhabitants among the country's vassal states who were displeased with their status. Most of all, the former emperor's practice of annual hunts for women had left the farming villages with a serious shortage of potential brides. It had been only 5 years since his former majesty had departed this world, and there must have been many who still remembered his rule all too well. As for more recent events, slavery had been abolished upon the accession of the current emperor, no doubt depriving more than a few merchants of their source of income. Hey, what do you think you're doing? I said stay back. Lihaku caught Mama's shoulder, glowering. Oh, I was just curious about something. Mama peered into a broken window. Then she slipped neatly out of Lihaku's grip and scampered into the building. Scorched stores were everywhere. From the potatoes rolling around on the floor, she gathered that this warehouse must have been used to store food. What a shame, she thought, that the potatoes had gone past the point of being well cooked and were now hopelessly blackened. Looking for something else that might have fallen on the ground, Mama discovered some kind of stick. The moment she touched it, though, it turned to ash, leaving only the carefully worked tip. Is this ivory? She wondered. It looks like a smoking pipe. She brushed off the decorative stummel and studied it. Listen, you can't just wander around in here, Lihaku said, finally and understandably, starting to sound angry. But once Mama was invested in a problem, she couldn't let it go. She crossed her arms, trying to put the pieces together in her head. An explosion, a warehouse full of food, and a pipe on the ground. Did you hear me? I heard you. Yes, she heard Lihaku. She just wasn't listening to him. Mama was aware this was a bad habit of hers. She left the warehouse, heading toward the one directly opposite, where the goods that had been saved from the fire had been moved. "Does this storehouse have the same sort of things in it as the one that burned?" Mama asked the lower-ranking soldier. "Yeah, I think so. Oldest stuff is furthest inside, apparently." Mama smacked a closely woven cloth sack, producing a cloud of white powder. Wheat flour, she presumed. "Can I have this?" she asked, pointing to an unused wooden crate. It was well built with close fittings, probably intended for storing fruit or the like. "Yeah, I guess, but what are you going to do with it?" Lihaku gave her a blank look. "I'll explain later. Oh, and I'll take this too." Mama grabbed a wooden board that looked suited to serve as a lid for a crate. Now she had everything she needed. "Have you got a hammer and saw anywhere? And nails. I'll need nails." "What exactly are you planning to do?" "Just a little experiment." "Experiment?" Lihaku looked befuddled, but his curiosity got the better of him. He was apparently going to cooperate with her, though still somewhat grudgingly. His subordinate was looking at Mau as if to say, "Who does this girl think she is?" But when he saw his superior was going along with her, he had no choice but to get what she asked for. Supplies thus provided, Mau began to diligently arrange her materials. With the saw, she made a hole in the wooden board, then hammered it down on the empty crate. "That's weird. It's like you've done this before." Lihaku, watching her, showed all the interest of a dog spotting a new toy. "I grew up without much money, so I learned to make what I didn't have." Her old man had likewise built a range of curious things. Her adoptive father, who had studied in the West in his youth, drew on those long-ago memories to create tools and gadgets no one had ever seen in this country. "There, finished," Mau said after a few moments. "All it needs is a bit of this." She took some of the flour from the stores and put it in the box. "You wouldn't happen to have a fire starter on hand, would you?" One of Lihaku's subordinates volunteered to get one. While he was away, Mama got a bucket of water from the well. Lihaku, still totally baffled as to what was going on, was sitting on the box, his chin in his hands. "Thank you very much," Mama nodded to the subordinate, who had returned with a length of smoldering rope. The underling could grimace all he liked, but he was ultimately curious about what Mama was going to do. He squatted at a distance and watched them. Mama went and stood in front of the crate with her wick, but for some reason Lihaku was standing right there beside her. She leveled her gaze at him. "Master Lihaku, this is dangerous. Might I ask you to keep a safe distance?" "Danger? If a young lady like you can do it, surely a warrior like myself is at no real risk." He was obviously set on acting as proud and manly as he could, so Mama gave up the argument. Some people just had to learn through experience. "Very well," she said, "but there is risk involved, so please take due caution. Be ready to run away immediately." "Run away? From what?" Mau ignored Lihaku's incredulous look, tugging on the sleeve of the crouching underling and advising him to watch from behind the storehouse. When all was in readiness, Mau pitched the burning rope into the crate. Then she covered her head and ran. Lihaku only watched her in perplexity. I told him. A second later, a fire burst from the crate, burning hungrily. "Ah!" Lihaku dodged the pillar of flame by inches, or most of him did anyway. His hair managed to catch the edge of the conflagration. "Put it out!" he cried, panicking. Mau picked up the bucket of water she had prepared and doused him with it. The fire went out, leaving only some smoke and the smell of singed hair. "I told you to run." Mau looked at Lihaku as if to ask where he understood the danger now. As Lihaku stood with snot dripping from his nose, his subordinate quickly tossed an animal pelt on him. The man seemed to want to make some sort of comment, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "Perhaps you could be so kind as to request the watchman of the storehouse to refrain from smoking tobacco on duty." Mama's assessment of the cause of the fire was really speculation, but she felt safe treating it as fact. "Right," Lihaku replied, looking relieved. He was ghostly pale. However strong he might be, he could catch cold if he didn't warm up soon. He should have been hurrying back to his quarters to light a fire, but instead he was staring fixedly at Mau. But what in the world was all that about? She could practically see the question mark above his head. His subordinates looked likewise flummoxed. "Here's your culprit." Mau took a handful of the wheat flour. A gust of wind came up and spirited the white powder away. Wheat flour and buckwheat flour are both highly flammable. They can combust if there's enough in the air. The flour had exploded. It was as simple as that. Anyone could understand it, once they knew what had happened. Lihaku simply hadn't been aware of the possibility. There were few, if any, things in the world that were truly inexplicable. What a person deemed beyond explanation was only a reflection of the boundaries of their own knowledge. "Pretty impressed you knew about that," Lihaku said. "Oh, I used to do it quite often." "Used to do what?" Lihaku and his subordinate were looking at each other, confused once again. Fair enough, they'd never in their lives had to work in a cramped space full of flour. Mau, meanwhile, had learned to be careful after she'd blown backwards out of the room she had been borrowing in the Verdigris house. I thought the old lady would have had my head that day. Just thinking about it was enough to give her the shivers. She'd thought she was going to wind up hung upside down from the highest floor of the brothel. Please take care you don't catch a cold, sir, but if you do, let me recommend the medicine of a man named Loman in the Pleasure District. It's quite effective. Mustn't forget promotion. Lihaku might buy her father's medicine on one of his visits to Piding. Mama's old man was as terrible a salesman as he was brilliant a pharmacist, so if she didn't do it at least this much, he might not make enough to feed himself. That took longer than it meant to. Mama picked up the basket of scrap paper and turned once more for the trash pit. It was just nearby. She would hustle the attendant and then get out of there. Oops, she thought. Looks like I unintentionally took a souvenir. She realized the item she'd picked up earlier was still at the collar of her robe. The pipe. This was the reason she'd said to warn the watchman about smoking. The stummel in her hand was a bit singed, but clearly of fine make, a rather finer piece than one would expect to be in the possession of a simple storehouse guard. Might be important to him, she thought. A little polishing and a new shank, and it would be good as new. Word was there had been injuries but no deaths in the explosion, meaning the pipe's owner was probably recuperating somewhere. He might not want it anymore, too many bad memories, but if nothing else, the stummel would sell for a decent price. For the time being, Mama tucked the soot-stained ivory piece into the top of her robe. Going to have to work late tonight, she thought as she handed the waste to the trash pit attendant. Chapter 3. Teaching at the Rear Palace. What in the world is going on in there? No idea. The question came from Gaoxuan, the blunt answer from Jinshi. They were standing before a lecture hall in the rear palace. Inside, the highest-ranking consorts were having some sort of lesson, supposedly in the interest of helping them fulfill their duties as concubines. All around, eunuchs and lesser serving ladies who had been summarily driven out of the hall stood by, looking just as perplexed as Jinshi. A few even had their ears to the doors. Nothing makes a person more interested in something than being told it's a secret. But whatever could that secret be? One special reason for the gripping curiosity was that the lecturer was a young freckled woman servant. No one could quite say what she was doing there. It had all started about 10 days before. Jinshi, still in his sleepwear, watched Mau clean, just the prelude to another long day of hard work. If you're looking for your breakfast, Lady Sweden is preparing it right now, she said. One person was more than enough to handle making the morning meal, so while Sweden did that, Mau got a start on cleaning the room. Any wasted time meant she would never finish all the chores in this building before noon. The old lady-in-waiting certainly took full advantage of her new assistant. I wonder if I did something to upset him, Mama thought. If she had, it was probably that she'd quietly planted the seeds of some medicinal herbs in the garden. But she didn't think anyone knew about that yet. Her heart picked up speed all the same. Then Jinshi said, "As a new pure consort has arrived, the rear palace has requested education of the consorts." The pure consort was one of the 4 highest-ranking ladies in the rear palace, and the title had been vacated at the tail end of the previous year. "Is that so?" Mau replied without interest as she continued to dust. She ran the rag along the floor as hard as if the timbers had killed her parents and she was taking revenge. It had been part of her daily routine since she'd been assigned to Jinshi's personal service. There were probably other jobs she could have been doing, but maid's work was all she'd known, and frankly, she couldn't think of what other jobs might be. So instead, she threw herself into cleaning as if her life depended on it. Jinshi occasionally gave her disapproving looks, but Mama was of the opinion that if he didn't give her specific instructions, she was under no obligation to do anything in particular. Now, Jinshi crouched down so his gaze was on a level with Mau's. He was holding some sort of scroll. "They want a teacher." "Oh, they have someone in mind?" "You?" Mama reflexively glared at Jinshi. It was not ideal, perhaps, for a cleaning girl to give her direct employer a look as if she was regarding some dirt in a corner, but old habits die hard. It provoked an inscrutable expression from Jinshi. "A fine joke, sir." "Who's joking?" Jinshi showed her the scroll he was holding. Mama's expression darkened as she read it, for what was written there was most inconvenient. Indeed, she would have liked to pretend the scroll didn't exist. "You can't get out of this just by pretending not to look." "Whatever do you mean?" "I know you read it just now. I saw you." "That was your imagination, I assure you." Jinshi unrolled the scroll and pointed directly at the most inconvenient part of all. He pushed the missive toward Mau, most stubborn. "Look here, a direct endorsement." Mama was silent. The words, "wise consort Liwa," hovered directly beside Jinshi's finger. Now she's done it, Mama thought. "Count me out," was all she said, and so, for the day, the matter was closed. But it couldn't last. The next day, another scroll arrived with the same request. This time, the endorsement was provided by Consort Gyokyo. With two of the great consorts having affixed their names to these letters, even Mamau couldn't ignore them anymore. She could easily picture the red-haired concubine laughing merrily to herself. This time, the request further stipulated that an appropriate honorarium would be provided. Mamau was resigned to it now, albeit with many a sigh and shudder. So she sent a letter home, a necessary first step in preparing for the job she had been asked to do. By home, though, she meant not to Loman, but to the courtesans who had been like parents to her. Several days later, the items she had requested arrived, along with an invoice from the madam. Mama thought the old lady had seriously inflated the price, but nonetheless, she discreetly added an extra 0 to the number before passing the bill to Jinshi. He scrutinized it, but seemed prepared to accept the cost, when Sweden appeared out of nowhere and said with a chuckle, "I think the ink in this number is just a slightly different shade from the rest." She plucked the invoice from Jinshi's hands and gave it back to Mamau. "Why, old lady," Mamau thought. So long as Sweden was there, it would be a tall order for anyone to make a mark of her sheltered young master. Mamau was left with no choice but to admit the original price. If they'd had a mind to, Jinshi and Sweden could have argued that Mamau should cover the expense herself, so she was happy that they complacently paid the sum. When the goods from the courtesans were delivered, Mamau veritably shoved Gauchwin aside and took them herself. Jinshi was as interested as a nosy puppy, but Mamau steadfastly refused to break any of the seals, quickly requisitioning a cart and taking the items away. "Shall I help you?" Gauchwin asked, but Mamau politely refused him, taking her acquisitions to her room. Jinshi demanded to see what she had received, but she opened her eyes as wide as she could and stared him down, and after a moment he quietly withdrew. She could hardly show him her all-important teaching materials. Mama had decided if she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. Finally, the day arrived. For the first time in a long while, Mamau set foot in the rear palace in the inner court. She found the slight feminine fragrance that suffused the place to be oddly calming. The lecture hall that had been prepared for her was in fact quite large, enough to seat several hundred people. It had been sleeping quarters for the maids under the previous emperor, when the population of the rear palace had ballooned and individual rooms couldn't be built rapidly enough to keep up. Now, though, it went largely unused. It was a complete waste to leave it standing empty, but it would have been an even greater waste to tear it down. Indeed, many such buildings dotted the rear palace. I don't need all this space, Mama thought. She wasn't teaching anything particularly important, so why was such a crowd gathering? Middle and lower ranked consorts and their entourages all but surrounded the lecture hall, while more than a few maids rubbernecked from a distance. The subject of instruction on this occasion was of no small importance to the consorts and concubines. In some sense, it could even be said to bear on the future of the nation, but for Mau all it did was elicit a long sigh. "All right, listen up," Jinshi said. "Only the high consorts are to receive instruction." One might have expected disappointment among the lower-ranking consorts at this pronouncement, but quite to the contrary, many of them were seemingly satisfied at having gotten a glimpse of Jinshi. At least half had apparently only come to see or even hear him. They clung to pillars and railings all around. It looked awfully overdramatic to Mau, but more than a few such ladies were doing it. She sometimes wondered if this eunuch wasn't in fact some fell spirit who bewitched those around him. When the moment arrived, Mau entered the lecture hall to find Jinshi trotting at her heels. She set her jaw and glared at him. "What?" he asked, but Mau only pushed him back out of the room. His willowy figure belied how much work it took to shove him out the door. "But why?" he said. "Because what will transpire here is secret, confidential, and positively not for outsiders. I was asked to instruct our honored consorts, and last I checked, Master Jinshi, you were not one of them." Then she shut and barred the door. She let out a long breath, then took an appraising look around the lecture hall. 9 people were present, the 4 high consorts, with 1 attendant each, and Mau. There was an audible murmur from the other side of the door, because she had ejected Jinshi most likely. She had the distinct sense that someone or several someones were trying hard to listen. Mau pushed her little cart to the center of the hall, then slowly bowed her head. "My cordial greetings to you, honored ladies. I, Mau, humbly present myself to you as your instructor." Consort Gyokyo, looking as lovely as ever, gave a friendly little wave. Her attendant, her chief lady-in-waiting Hangyang, observed this dubiously. Consort Liwa had finally gotten most of the meat back on her bones, and she was watching Mau Mau placidly. The same couldn't be said of the lady-in-waiting who attended her, whose face contorted when she saw Mau Mau. Mau Mau savored the moment. As for Consort Lishu, she exuded the same slight air of nervousness as always. No doubt she was trying to take extra care with the 3 other high consorts around. The lady-in-waiting attending her didn't look any more comfortable than her mistress, but the way she was obviously set on protecting the consort brought a smile to Mau Mau's heart. Finally, the last of the august ladies, a face Mau Mau hadn't seen before. The young woman who had replaced one of the former high consorts was about Mau Mau's age. She was Lolan, the new pure consort. She had her black hair tied up high on her head, and in place of a hair stick she used the feather of a bird from the southern reaches. Her dress suggested she might be a princess from the southern lands, but her physiognomy was more that of a northerner. Her lady-in-waiting looked the same way, and Mau Mau concluded that the style of dress must have been a personal preference. Lolan was neither as alluring as Gyokyo nor as dazzling as Liwa. Unlike Lishu, she was of an appropriate age to share a bed with the emperor, but for the moment it didn't appear she would threaten the delicate balance of the rear palace. That costume, though, it made her by and far the most conspicuous of the 4 consorts. In particular, her makeup accented the corners of her eyes so emphatically that it was impossible to tell what they really looked like. Mau Mau could hardly picture how the consort must appear without cosmetics. Not that it matters to me. With her little introduction complete, Mau Mau pulled a stack of textbooks from among her supplies and began passing them out, one to each consort. Each had her own reaction as she took her copy: widening eyes, an amused chuckle, a furious flush of the cheeks, a furrowed brow. About what I expected, Mau Mau thought. Next she produced a collection of tools. About half of those present regarded them with confusion, while most of the others seemed to know what they were for. The handful in between didn't know exactly, but seemed to guess, and blushed. I wish to stress that what I'm about to teach you are trade secrets of the Garden of Women, and must not be divulged to outsiders, Mau Mau said, and then she instructed her pupils to open their textbooks to page 3. A good 2 hours or so later, Mau Mau's lecture was finally finished. Maybe I tried to tackle too much at once, she thought. Even Mau Mau was feeling a bit spent by it. She drifted over to the door of the lecture hall and undid the bar. That went on for a while. The gorgeous eunuch wandered in, looking quite at his leisure. He did seem ever so slightly annoyed, and for some reason his left cheek and ear were red. Mau Mau was at least kind enough not to openly accuse him of eavesdropping. Jinshi regarded the room he had entered with mute amazement. Is something the matter, sir? You took the words right out of my mouth, he said, looking closely at Mau Mau. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. She had only given the consorts of the rear palace instruction in the necessary knowledge, as she had been requested. As for the individual consorts, their responses to Mau Mau's lecture were as follows. Gyokyo was enthused. Finally, some new tricks, she was saying. Hong Yang attended her with her customary expression of fatigue. She might have also been occasionally casting glares in Mau Mau's direction, but the lecturer chose to ignore her. Liwa's cheeks were slightly flushed, but her finger traced down the page as she reviewed the lesson. She seemed quite satisfied. The lady-in-waiting with her was red as a beet and looking firmly at the ground, trembling. Lishu was in a corner of the room with her forehead pressed to the wall, mumbling, I can't, I couldn't, it's impossible. All the blood had drained from her face. Her attendant, only recently promoted to her chief lady-in-waiting, Mau Mau believed she recognized the woman as Lishu's former food taster, patted her back consolingly. As for Lolan, she was staring into space with a distant expression. Mau Mau couldn't guess what she might be thinking. Her attendant wasn't quite sure what to do with the textbook lying in front of them. With some embarrassment, she packed it in a carrying cloth. I don't care what they do with it, Mau Mau thought as she packed up her things and accepted a cup of cool water. She let out a breath. She was tired, but the thought of the envelope full of money she would receive took the edge off her fatigue. Each of the consorts was allowed to keep the instructional materials she'd received. Some clutched their books lovingly, while others touched them only with evident trepidation. In any event, Mau Mau urged them to wrap the items in traveling cloths so that they might not be seen, and further reiterated that they should not be shown to anybody. Jinshi and the others, who had been excluded from the lecture, watched, mystified. What exactly did you teach them? Jinshi inquired. Mau Mau didn't quite look at him, but rather somewhere past him. Next time you see the emperor, ask what he thought of my lesson, she said. As to the content of her instruction, she would leave that to Jinshi's imagination.